The Data Engineering Show is brought to you by Firebolt. It's the cloud data warehouse for insanely fast analytics over terabytes of data with fewer resources.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Data Engineering Show. Today we're joined by Barr Moses, who's the co-founder and CEO of Monte Carlo. So for everyone who hasn't heard about Monte Carlo before, basically it's a data observability company or a data observability platform. And I'm sure Barr will go into much more detail kind of a minute from now. Some maybe high-level facts about Barr, about Monte Carlo. So they've recently raised 135 million Series D in May of last year, so 22. Right, and exactly, Barr is the co-founder. And before that, kind of spent a bunch of time in a bunch of different places. And I'm sure she'll tell us more about that in just a minute. Perfect. And Eldad, of course, thanks for joining as well.
Thanks for having me, as always.
Good to have you.
Nice. Perfect introduction. You're getting better with each episode.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? Like all the prep work and kind of practicing in front of the mirror paying off.
Can I get compliments too on my progress throughout podcasts? Is that possible?
You're amazing.
Thank you so much.
Our sample size is 1, so I'm not sure if we can. Perfect. But so, Barr, do you want to basically kind of give us the high-level story of what Monte Carlo does, what data observability is all about?
But start with yourself.
For all of our listeners.
Yourself as well.
Yeah, so my name is Barr. I started Monte Carlo, I guess 3.5 years ago. In short, Monte Carlo's mission is to help organizations actually use data by reducing what we call data downtime. We've coined the term data downtime. And in brief, data downtime is periods of time when your data is wrong, erroneous, inaccurate, or just unusable or untrustable for some reason. And that is a reality that data teams everywhere experience. And so we're fortunate to work with hundreds of customers ranging from folks like Vimeo, Drata, Gusto, CNN, New York Times, Roche, many others, all of whom have data teams who want to deliver trusted data. And that's really hard to do if you're not thinking about data observability. So, kind of taking a step back and thinking about my background, I was born and raised in Israel, started my career in the Israeli Air Force. And throughout my career, worked with data in different formats. And it was actually sort of present in what I would call this acceleration of data. Like, I guess a decade ago, we said we're data-driven. No one was really using data. We maybe collected a little bit data and thought, we were cool and moved on with our lives. And then maybe I want to say 3 to 5 years ago, people realized that you can actually make decisions based on data. And in fact, your decisions might be better if you use data. I think that was a big change for companies. I think we're still in the period of time when we're trying to figure out how to do that. We haven't figured out how to do that quite yet. One of the most interesting trends, I think that's the backdrop to that, is what people call today data products. And by that, I basically mean people using data, whether it's for internal reports, for data teams to make, for teams to make decisions based on data, or actually customers who are using data. Maybe that can be, a dashboard that, your customers use, or your website. There's lots of examples for how customers actually use data. And once we start putting that data out there, it better be accurate. My personal story, I was, prior to Monte Carlo, I was at a company called Gainsight. Fortunate to be part of the category creation story at Gainsight. And at Gainsight, we helped organizations basically reduce churn, increase renewal rates and upsells, and basically increase customer happiness based on data. And I was responsible for the team that was using data, both to make decisions internally, but also to surface with our customers. And the problem was the data was wrong all the time, literally just all the time. Fast forward to today, there's some examples of where data being wrong is really painful. One of the most examples from that time, 2016, was that Netflix was down for 45 minutes because of duplicate data. Netflix down for 45 minutes is really freaking long.
I remember that moment.
Do you remember? Where were you in that moment? But guess what? They were down because of duplicate data. How crazy is that? And so in this world where actually data being down is the main culprit, or even worse than applications being down. And in that world, you need to make sure that your data is accurate. Otherwise, your applications and infrastructure are going to be down. And that is a big change that has happened over my career in the last decade or so. And I remember this was in 2016. I was responsible for a data team that was delivering data. And as I mentioned, like the data was wrong all the time. And I tried to fix it. And I was like, this is so freaking hard. Like I remember going into like a room with a whiteboard and trying to like draw things. And, I'm not an engineer. And I'm like, oh, this is like so terrible. Why is this so freaking hard? And I remember asking our customers too. And they were like, yeah, there's just no way to do this. We just have like, 6 eyes on every pair of reports on every report. And I was like, really? We need like 3 or 4 different people to vet every single report? Like that's
classic
where we're at.
BI mindset.
Yeah, exactly. Like, are you like, what? Like, is that normal? At some point you don't know if you're crazy or the world is crazy or both, or like what's actually happening. And, basically that actually inspired, me and my team to try to build something. Me and the person on my team, his name is Will Robbins. He's actually at Monte Carlo today, leading work on product and customer success. So it's pretty cool to continue that path. And, the bottom line is we hacked something together, which was pretty crap, to be honest. But it worked well enough and improved the like nothing that we had today. And then we, implemented with some of our customers and it worked well for them too. And I was like, hey, why don't we get someone who's like actually an engineer to build this and let's see what happens. Like, can we build something? And then when we look at our software engineering counterparts, like, yeah, they have solutions like, New Relic and App Dynamics back in the day, and then Datadog now. And you're like, yeah, you have to be, really irrational to build an engineering team without some observability platform or some observability measure. Why are data teams releasing data out in the wild without something like observability or ways to make sure the data is accurate? And so that basically kind of inspired, starting Monte Carlo. Spoke with hundreds of data teams, asking them like, hey, what's keeping you up at night? And kept coming back to this, to this problem that folks had, like literally people sweating on Monday morning because they're going to be, sharing a report and they're not sure if the data is right. Like, I don't know if you had that, but like you start getting like, you can hear your heart beating and you're like, oh man, like, is this going to be right? I don't know. Who's going to call out?
We talked to the same people. They couldn't sleep at night. We took the data warehouse part.
Okay.
You took the, you're saying so many things, and the reason it's so well, you've like data was serving consensus and BI, and it was all about having multiple versions of the truth, and we couldn't get out of it. And if you look at companies over the last 4 or 5 years, they've actually started to sell their data, utilize their data, build products on top of their data, and we're moving from having 3 people looking at a dashboard in the best case to having tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, and you can't apply the same mindset anymore. So, and also kind of you compared Monte Carlo to Datadog and others. I don't think so. I think whenever I hear Monte Carlo, first, it's on a whole different ballgame. So it's kind of less SRE observability and more really it's all about data observability, data quality. Now, data quality needs to come first before it gets out to the customer. Observability goes after. So kind of it serves different need. And this is why I love Monte Carlo, because to me, this is the first company that looks at data, it looks how users use data and rethinks observability from scratch. And it's also nice that you brought real engineer eventually to build something serious out of it, and which is amazing. And we hear you all the time. So yeah, so tell us. So you quit the second you realized that nobody understands you when you drew that on the whiteboard, including the customers. How did that feel?
I'm not sure it was that dramatic, but yeah, I mean, I think I had. I think the experience of working with customers and the data being wrong all the time was terrible, like really bad. And I think that was for me personally. Like I would get, emails from people like WTF, right? Like, what the fuck? Why is the data wrong? And, as a data professional, you're like, I had one job, which is get the data right. Like one job, right? And when you can't get that right, I think that's very frustrating. And when, I think when talking to other people and they're like, yeah, that's kind of like what happens. We sort of came to accept that as sort of normal. Like, yeah, the data is wrong and that's okay. And I remember living in that period and I was like, there's just no way that I can accept that. And I don't think that makes sense. Like, we have to get over that. Like the days where it's fine that the data is wrong, it's just not cool anymore. Like you can't, because data is used, like, for example, in reporting numbers to the street, right? So companies that almost reported wrong numbers to the street, that happens, right? Or companies that actually like lose millions of dollars because the data is wrong. Or I'll give an example, like, the most notable examples from the last few months, Unity is a gaming company that basically like made one mistake with their ad data, and that one mistake cost them $100 million. Like one mistake. That's like a big freaking deal. It's not like one mistake over a long period of time, like multiple issues. It's like one issue, $100 million. That's crazy. And that was made public. Think about all the issues that are not made public, right? They're way worse. And then to give you an example that's more kind of like on the social side. So Equifax, for folks who are not familiar, is a credit score company. So basically assigns credit scores to users and allows those users to take loans, take mortgages, basically to like live their lives, right? And it was made public that Equifax actually issued millions of wrong credit scores to users based on wrong data. That means millions of users that have like the wrong credit scores today and literally
inflation.
Yeah, and they can blame inflation, exactly, or whatever it is, right? But how you think about the impact of bad data has on a personal life, like even one person that's impacted in that way is terrible. Think about millions of people who have that is horrible. And so I think there's like these trends, right? One is like we're using data more and more. To your point, it's not just 3 people in some team looking at data once a year, maybe once a quarter. It's actually like millions of people using the data, and actually like the stakes are way higher. They're not just looking at the dashboard. They're actually like making decisions based on it, or they're, trying to get a mortgage based on it. And in all those instances, the data being wrong is just way, way worse. So I think there's just this point that we've like crossed in the last few years, and we can't look back. We can't unsee what we've seen with data now. It's just not the same.
We went all in on data, and it's too late to go back, at least for the next 20 years. But tell me, so from product perspective, data is moving around so much, and there's so many hands being involved, apps, scripts, processes, steps. And in each step, data gets changed, gets expanded and enriched. And where do you fit in? Is like, and if I'm a data warehouse or an engineer, can I use you as a data source to make sure that my data is kind of flow, like, no matter where it's coming from, I want to use you as my formal data source? Does that connect to my JDBC driver? Like, how does it work from a product integration perspective?
Yeah, for sure. So a few things. I would say, first of all, just to use this as a opportunity to explain the difference between data quality and data observability. Like I think a few years ago, when data teams were thinking about data quality, they were really like pulling a report from SAP or I don't know, something where it's like they had all the data in one place. You just had to like dump the data once, and then you would like use it once a quarter or something like that. And in those instances, like making sure that, I think the concept of like garbage in, garbage out was really popularized at the time. And that made it like really important to make sure like that. I think that was the rise of data quality, right? And during that time, it was very important for data teams or for analysts to make sure that the data is accurate, single point in time, and like that's it. But the world in which we're today, which is a pretty cool world, by the way, like in terms of like how we use data, is one in which there's like so many people using data. So there's like engineering teams upstream influencing, schema changes, making adaptations or changes to code that have downstream implications. There's data engineers, there are data scientists, analytics engineers, machine learning engineers, like the list is long, right? And each of these people actually wants to use data, and each of them needs to be able to use data. And so lots of things that are kind of a common trend or common thing that customers ask us is, how do I democratize data health or data quality? Like, how do I make sure that the ability to know the data is accurate is not just for one person on the data team, but for everyone who's working with data? And I think that has to do with your question around where does data live, right? And the thing is, because there's so many people working with data, data also lives in different places. And so in order to make sure that your data is actually accurate and trusted, it's no longer sufficient that you're just looking at data in one place. You actually need to make sure that the data is accurate wherever it is. That may be your data lake, your data warehouse. You want to use some of your ETL or orchestration solutions to help make sure that the changes that you're making there are not influencing data quality, as well as your BI, right? So at any given point of time, you have to be aware of the changes made to data and making sure that data is trusted and kind of remains equal. I'll tell you a little bit about kind of like the history and evolution from my perspective. Before starting Monte Carlo, when I personally experienced this, noticed that all of my customers experienced this, decided to leave Monte Carlo and actually decided to start a company. And I actually, fun fact, started 3 companies in parallel. So like worked on 2 different ideas that are totally different to kind of see what kind of pull looks like. And so in those early days, I actually in order to test this idea of data being wrong, actually reached out to lots of people and asked them, does this ever happen to you? And it was really hard to explain, what does this happen? And I was looking recently at some of the wording that I used. And basically it was reports breaking or dashboards wrong. And that reality has not changed. Those words still, hit a chord with data teams. You still get dashboards breaking. You still have reports going wrong. The thing is, it's not just because of one source. It's because we now have data coming from your data warehouse, from your data lake, going through so many different transformations. It's actually hard to trace why the report broke or why the dashboard is wrong. But that core problem actually hasn't changed. And I think we can trace that back to years ago when people are starting to use data and starting to ask themselves, can I actually trust this data?
Can you give some concrete examples, right? Say I integrate with Monte Carlo today, what are the actual types of insights kind of you can provide as a product?
Yeah, totally. I'm trying not to pitch Monte Carlo here. But basically I'll give specific examples.
We're getting great existing and future product features from Monte Carlo. So if there are startups out there trying to compete with Monte Carlo, now would be a time to listen carefully.
Great soundbite. Not gonna happen. Just kidding. So here's how to think about what data observability actually means. And I think we touched on a couple of those already in very technical sense. One is it has to have coverage end to end. By that, we mean wherever your data is, it has to cover it. Now, for some data teams, that might mean Firebolt or other competitors not to be named, but others like AWS, Snowflake, Databricks, right? Different types of places to store your data, aggregate, analyze it, as well as your orchestrator. So you might have dbt as well, just use that as an example. And let's choose a BI. Let's say you have Looker, right? So, for many modern data teams, it'd be a modern data stack. Actually having a solution that can cover all of those, all of those 3 categories is very important. Data warehouse, data lake, ETL orchestration, and BI. Again, because data is each of those things. And so actually having integrations that work, which each of these is very important for your observability platform, whether that be Monte Carlo or not. I think the second thing that's important is what does it actually do, or how easy is it to get started with? Oftentimes in data quality solutions in the past, everything was manual. So you had to manually specify the thresholds that you want for your rules. And you had to manually specify what lineage looks like. That doesn't cut it anymore, not even close. Solutions need to be automated. And so within 24 hours, you need to have a view of your lineage, both upstream and downstream, both table and field level. And you need to have a baseline for what healthy tables look like. So for example, if you have particular distribution of a field, let's say there's some specific null rate, it is possible to learn automatically what is the acceptable null rate and let users know if that's being violated. Without actually any end user specifying that, as an example. So having this kind of aspect of within 24 to 48 hours, getting started with those sort of machine learning out of the box elements is super important. Then the third thing that I would say is what we call the 5 pillars of data observability. Those are freshness, volume, schema, data quality, and lineage. I touched on each of them, but just to kind of explain the history and why they've come together. I mentioned we spoke to hundreds of data leaders before we even started the company. I would say by now we've spoken to thousands of them. We've worked with thousands of data engineering users and hundreds of data teams, and actually asked them what are the main reasons for why data goes wrong, and what does it look like when you're trying to troubleshoot it and resolve it. In the reality is there's actually a lot more commonality than people think. I think one of the main objections that folks have for observability is that they think that, everyone's a snowflake and your data is different. And yeah, that's true. You are a snowflake, you're very special, and your data is different, but there is some patterns along with other folks and how they use data. And so there is actually a certain amount of help that automation can introduce. And so by codifying these 5 pillars, we're able to actually capture what the best data teams look for when automating observability. So the first around freshness, pretty straightforward, but basically, is your data up to date? Is the easiest way to summarize that. The second is volume, which is basically like, is the volume of the data that you have in line with historical patterns, or what you'd expect it to be. So literally in terms of like the size of the file or number of rows. The third is schema changes. Schema changes is a big deal for folks who know. It's also kind of tied to a different trend called data contracts. We might touch on that later. Schema changes cause problems. It's like the bane of existence for many data teams. And so actually tracking schema changes in an automatic way is a huge help. Fun fact, it's one of the very first things that we did in the product because it was so impactful on data teams to know what are some of the schema changes that folks have. The fourth is data quality, which is basically you can think kind of from the worlds of profiling and actually making sure that the data itself at the field level is accurate. So, values that you expect. I talked about null rates, unique IDs, et cetera. And then the fifth, which is lineage, kind of brings it all together. Talked a little bit about lineage, but power of lineage is that when data goes wrong, the first thing that people ask themselves is like, where and who cares about this? Like if there's some, we talked about everybody like hoarding data and using a lot of data. If you're dumping data that nobody cares about, no one's using, maybe like O'Neill Dudd is looking at it at 6 a.m., but like that's it. No one other than Dudd. So maybe like it doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't have to be accurate, right? But if Ben is looking at the data or if Bart's looking at the data, then you really want to make sure the data is accurate. Or maybe your customers are actually using it. And so being able to answer that question, like, hey, is there anyone downstream who is using this data who should care about that? And if so, this should be a high priority. And maybe you can start thinking about actually announcing severity, automatic severity to your data incidents and saying, hey, like there's specific conditions under which this data needs to be, there's like a higher standard for it to be accurate and trusted. And so bringing it all together, I think that's sort of what makes a strong data observability platform. And we see amazing, amazing data stories of customers. Like I'll just use JetBlue for an example for folks who've been flying a lot recently for the holidays and, with the snowstorm and everything, there's a lot going on. And, for a company like JetBlue, they manage tons of data, right? So they use data both to drive their operations, whether it's like, flight time or like, where's your luggage and what's your connecting flight, but also to manage their support, right? And so the data team at JetBlue is actually like a great story of a team that's like very, very thoughtful about making sure that data is accurate. So your flight is on time, so you get your luggage, et cetera. And so working with the data team with the JetBlue data team has been really cool. They, for example, manage like 100% status rate incident every single week, where literally every single week they go through each and every incident in Monte Carlo in particular, and then triage that to make sure that the data quality issue is resolved. And they're actually able to reduce significantly the number of data downtime incidents as a result.
Awesome. So especially looking at data lineage, right? How does, especially in big companies, adoption of a data observability tool actually look, right? Is it like, okay, you need buy-in from everyone and then you need to kind of integrate it across your entire stack because that's how you get the most value? Or is it like, okay, kind of here's a single data team in your big company and you can integrate it with your kind of local part and already get value?
Yeah, every big journey starts with small steps towards that big journey. So for sure, I'm definitely in the camp of like start small and grow from there. Mostly because in any organization, you want to show value and have like a win story really quickly. I think that's true for anyone, not just observability. But I think in data in particular, if you put yourself in the shoes of the data teams in large organizations, they're in a tricky spot. And I'll explain why. They invested a ton in the last few years in the best data infrastructure, literally like world-class data warehouse, data lake, world-class infrastructure. And also they invested a ton in hiring lots of people to use that data, right? Like we've seen the rise of data scientists. All of those roles have been growing a ton in the last few years. And here's a tricky spot. Now you actually need to deliver. You actually need to show that you can use the data. And that's a new reality, which I don't think many organizations have proved. And so you're on the hook to see the ROI of all that investment. And oftentimes the ROI doesn't exist because people don't actually trust the data or can't use it. And so I would say, in order to avoid being in that situation, starting to think early as you're rolling out your data infrastructure, how do I actually make sure that people also trust the data is really important. And for larger organizations, yes, I do think that starts with identifying a particular use case or a particular team. Like, for example, it could be a team that's supporting financial data in particular. That's very important. If you're reporting on, revenue growth or customer growth, you want to make sure that there's no questions about that data. Maybe starting with that. Sometimes there's a marketing team that you might want to start with. If they have, if they have hundreds of millions or tens of millions of dollars in budget, you want to make sure that that money is deployed, that resources are deployed. Another, kind of examples of companies in healthcare, for example, potentially you have production data and you want to make sure that that clinical data is accurate. In all of those instances, starting small, making sure that folks have the technology, but also have the mindset, right? Think about it. It's going back to Eldad's point from before, maybe the difference is that, an organization like Datadog, the concept of observability and engineering is something that lots of folks have done before, but for data teams, it's a new motion. And so understanding who's responsible for what and what you actually do is a totally new ballgame for most people. So actually, most of the work that we do is helping organizations think through what does a great data observability practice looks like. And oftentimes that has nothing to do with the technology. It's more around, the practices and, the types of culture that we have as a data team.
Definitely. Like, take us through that action part, right? So I'm a data engineer now. I get kind of my alert in my Slack channel. I don't know how it works, saying like kind of this upstream data pipeline is looking weird right now. Kind of like what actually happens, right? Is it about kind of spotting failure early to make sure you can kind of keep the surface area kind of small? Like, what's usually like the immediate action you take when you see these types of alerts?
Yeah, great question. So yes, oftentimes teams actually love getting, that information to them directly. And so that might be, in Slack or Teams or even via email, if you'd like. Large majority, I think, use Slack today. You get an alert in Slack, and that could be something like, hey, this table that gets updated typically every hour stopped updating for the last day and hasn't gotten an update for the last, let's say, 7 hours. And so there's a couple of things that you can do. First of all is if there's an automatically assigned severity, maybe you see that it's a high severity, might be a situation where you drop everything and take a look at it immediately. And maybe, on the contrary, maybe this is a data set that is not being used and not looked at, then maybe you can ignore it for now. Maybe you can snooze it, actually, and snooze it until tomorrow because today you're working on a production issue and you need to come back to it later. So assuming you didn't snooze it, you determine that this is actually high severity based on kind of the assigned severity and the impact of assets that it looks at. What you can take a look at is impact radius and start seeing, who are the folks who are impacted by this type of issue. So are there any, maybe it's for this particular table, there's like 3 reports in your BI that are actually using this. And the particular team that using that is a marketing team. Maybe what you could do is you could actually tag the person on that team and say hey, there's an issue here, FYI, I'm investigating. And then what you could start doing is actually click into, that alert and start investigating and say, okay, what else is happening around that time? What else is happening to that table that might give me clues as to why this issue is happening? And then maybe you can see, okay, well, the job is running, but, actually no data is arriving. So maybe there's a problem, with the load that's feeding data, right? Just as an example. Or maybe someone upstream you actually noticed made a schema change, and that schema change made it such that the implications are that now data is not arriving anymore. Maybe they changed the field type, and that kind of messed up the scheduling of the data into that particular table. And then, on the other hand, maybe when you look at the downstream implications, you recognize that you need to reload all the data to fix that and to make the report accurate now. So there's actually a lot of work that might be involved in both understanding why this issue has happened and also making sure that the data is sort of back to normal or back to its schedule. And so, it's a combination of looking at both the data itself, looking at metadata, And oftentimes looking at the code, actually, that's like driving all of this to make sure that the data pipeline itself is healthy. So, you might be sort of moving between those different systems and where you're at. And Monte Carlo in particular, we try to bring all of those different feeds into one place. So you actually like get both your alerts from Monte Carlo as well as your alerts from dbt in one place, for example. So if you're using dbt in this example, you might actually be notified about that same issue in the same place. And so bringing all of that together, maybe you realized, within, upon investigation, you realize you understand the root cause of the problem, you understand how to resolve it. And now the problem is that you're not actually responsible for the table itself, so you can't actually fix it. So you need to find who's the person who owns this. You can see that information as well, and then like ping them and work with that person to fix the issue. So at a high level, there's like 3 different things that we're trying to help users do. One is detect know about the problems almost in real time. Like just to give you, insight into this, most teams actually are not even aware of these issues. And so getting that alert in Slack is a big deal. The second thing that we help with is actually resolving these faster. So oftentimes data teams won't know all this information about like schema changes or freshness or volume, like all the examples that I mentioned. And it would be harder for them to pinpoint what exactly is happening and why. And then the third thing is by actually like increasing the communication and collaboration on this, you're making it easier for everyone who's touching data to know about data downtime issues and eventually actually preventing these from happening.
So would you say that in a few years from now, we will use less classic SRE black box mindset observability plus Jira and more kind of new age, context-driven, lineage-driven observability, which listening to you, like it's so different. It's so different from looking at CPU or disk utilization while someone altered the table, but that table affects 100 Looker dashboard. And that's not important. What's important is one of those dashboards serves a customer. And there's no way to know that without spending 3 weeks involving 6 people at least, using tons of tech. And companies try to do it on their own. They try to stitch it, they try to build it, and it's really sad. But listening to you makes me happy because it is a real thing. And as engineering organizations are trying to become data organizations, I think they have a lot to learn from that, from data engineering mindset, where it's taking very seriously. So when someone is modifying something, to those teams, that's like code. Like that's like a product release, and having an data observability that has the schema, that has the data warehouse. It's aware. It knows what an information schema is. It's not like just raw JSON pushed into some time series database, which is meaningless to most people. I love it. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think as a data industry, if we're successful, it's because we adopted what we need from engineering practices and built that into data engineering. It's going to be impossible for us to actually really, truly become data-driven if we don't do that. So yes, and I think, our approach is that starting with observability is the right place because it's the most imminent problem for engineers. If you look at data engineering today, the most imminent problem that they have is, hey, the data is wrong all the time. That's the number one thing that they have as an issue. And as a result, data consumers can't trust the data and can't use the data. I think there's a lot more that we can learn from engineering and that we should over time bring in a lot of those concepts into data. But starting with observability is what we think is sort of the thing that will bring the most value to customers today. And I'm curious to hear more about how you all think about it at Firebolt. But so feel free to let me know if y'all are up for it.
So we kind of we feel the pain and need to make sure that data quality is right. We've seen some really scary stories. You've mentioned some of them, but data is so actionable today. The customers that use data-driven products, their business run on those products. So if I'm subscribing to a sales optimization product, and that sales optimization product is giving me a recommendation on how to do my ad spending. And I'm going and just doing this ad spend based on that recommendation and it's wrong, that affects my business and it's real. So it's much more serious than, just looking at 2 different types of sales numbers, one coming from Salesforce and one from Excel. which is also important, right? We've been dealing with that for 20 years. But the beauty is that data is really driving the business now versus just being used to understand the business. So having data quality should be kind of trivial in core stack of any data-driven team. Listening to you and looking at kind of what you're doing there, we really want and wish Monte Carlo to succeed big time. And having said that, kind of maybe we can wrap with that. If you can share some insights, some recommendations, something with our fellow startups, with our fellow users. How do you see this year coming? What would you recommend for startups going forward? Anything valuable would be highly appreciated.
I can share only non-valuable advice. Actually, on that note, I will say, for startups or listeners, I will start by saying that you should not listen to advice. That's like my biggest takeaway. I think for any question that you have, both in data, in startups, and otherwise, you will always get like 50% of people will tell you something, and 50% of people will tell you the opposite. And so, really, I think the answer actually lies in the data. There's no one else but you to take a look at the data and listen to your customers and see what it tells you, and actually draw conclusions based on that. And so, folks who are asking themselves like, what does this mean for me and for my team and for the industry? Yeah, like you have the data. You are closest to the customer. Pick up the phone, talk to the customer, ask them what they think. That is the data that will help you get to the answer, whatever that may be. With that in mind, looking ahead to this year, I think this is the year that's sort of a natural progression of the importance of data teams. I think this, obviously, like it's no secret, that the market has changed, difficult times for lots of folks across the economy. And yet I continue to see data teams growing stronger and stronger in organizations. And that means companies doubling down on their data strategy, building more and more data products, and investing in data teams, because recognizing that data is a foundation to making strong business decisions, gaining competitive advantages, and generally furthering business outcomes for their customers. And so I think when we zoom out and think about like where are data teams today, I think they're on the hook to deliver ROI from all of their investments in the last few years. And this is the time when folks are going to be more scrutinized. Yes, I do think that folks will be asking themselves, like, is there actually ROI on this? And it's a great time for data teams to be able to articulate that and say, yes, we have awesome data, we have best-in-class infrastructure, and we can also trust the data so we can actually use it, to your point, to drive the business. And I think that's an inflection point that I'm really excited for data teams to bring. I hope 2023 will be the year that we see that. I don't think that we can see it soon enough, but I do think it's an inflection point that the data industry needs to drive. And I think there's no better time than this year to do this, because data teams are more important than ever. Data is more important than ever. And the onus on us to prove that is today. And so I'm excited to see us do that.
Awesome. That were amazing closing remarks. Barr, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Have a great rest of the day, and see you next time on the Data Engineering Show.
Thanks so much
for having me. Thank you, everyone.
Great
Looking
podcast.
forward.
If you like the show, rate it or leave a review to help us spread the word. The Data Engineering Show is brought to you by Firebolt. It's the cloud data warehouse for insanely fast analytics over terabytes of data with fewer resources.